The moment Kate Fairchild felt the warmth of that coat settle over her trembling shoulders, she stopped breathing. Not because of the cold, though the November wind had been slicing through the gaps in the old church walls like a blade since the service began. Not because of the rough wool that smelled of pine resin and leather and something darker, something earthly and real and alive. She stopped breathing because she knew, with every nerve ending she possessed, exactly whose coat it was. And the knowing of it cracked something open inside her chest that she had spent 6 months hammering shut with iron nails and sheer, grinding willpower. She did not turn around. She could not. Because turning around would mean looking at Cecil Trask's face, and looking at Cecil Trask's face in this moment, in this sacred, freezing church with the congregation of Redrock Falls singing Rock of Ages around them like nothing in the world had gone wrong, would undo her completely. She had secrets. He had secrets. And between those secrets lay a canyon so deep and dark that no bridge had ever been built to cross it, nor should one be. That was what she told herself every morning when she woke on the narrow cot in the back of Millie Dunbar's boarding house, and pressed her palms flat against her sternum to feel her own heartbeat and confirm she was still, against all odds, surviving. But the coat was warm, and Kate Fairchild had been cold for so long. She gripped the lapels with both hands and pulled it tighter, and behind her she heard the faintest shift of boot leather on pine boards, and then nothing. Cecil Trask did not speak. He did not lean forward and whisper. He simply stood behind her in that drafty church in Redrock Falls, Texas, on a Sunday morning in November of 1882, and let his warmth be a thing she could borrow. And that was when she understood, with the kind of clarity that only arrives at the absolute worst possible moment, that she was in serious, irreversible, catastrophic trouble. 6 months earlier, in the blazing heat of a May that had no mercy, Kate Fairchild had arrived in Redrock Falls by stagecoach from San Antonio with $17, a carpet bag, a wooden trunk, and a letter of introduction to one Mr. Harlan Webb, rancher, landowner, and prospective husband. She was 26 years old, which was considered past the bloom by the standards of polite Texas society in 1882, a fact that had been communicated to her with varying degrees of cruelty by various people throughout her life. Her own mother, God rest her, had communicated it most efficiently of all on her deathbed by simply saying, "Catherine, you must be practical now." Kate had tried to be practical. She had tried very hard. She had answered the advertisement in the San Antonio Daily Herald with careful, measured prose. She had described herself honestly, or as honestly as a woman in desperate circumstances could afford to be. Brown hair, she wrote, hazel eyes, passable education, competent at cooking and household management, no longer in the first bloom of youth but possessed of good health and a willing spirit. She had not written about her dark past, because no one ever did, and because some things belong to the locked room inside a person and nowhere else. Harlan Webb had written back promptly. His letter was businesslike and not unkind, though not warm either. He needed a wife. He had a working ranch. He was 43 years old, a widower, no children surviving. He had expectations, he wrote, and underlined the word. Kate had read that underlined word 17 times and each time told herself it was perfectly reasonable for a man to have expectations. The stagecoach deposited her in front of the Redrock Falls post office at 2:30 on a Tuesday, and the first thing she noticed about the town was the dust. Red dust, the color of old rust, that coated everything and everyone and seemed to seep directly into the lungs with every breath. The second thing she noticed was that it was beautiful, in the harsh, unsentimental way of West Texas, all terracotta bluffs and endless sky, and the silver thread of a creek cutting through the valley below the main street. The third thing she noticed was the man leaning against the post office wall. He was reading something, a folded paper of some kind, and he had the particular stillness of a person who is genuinely absorbed and has momentarily forgotten to be anywhere at all. He wore a dark brown coat, good quality but worn at the elbows, and a hat pushed back just enough to show a face that was, Kate thought with the objectivity of a woman who was absolutely not going to allow herself to think about strange men's faces, rather too interesting to be comfortable. Strong jaw, dark brows drawn together over whatever he was reading, a mouth that suggested both stubbornness and humor in equal measure. He was perhaps 30 or 31, lean and broad-shouldered, with the calloused hands of a man who worked with them. He looked up then, as if he felt the direction of her attention, and their eyes met for perhaps 3 seconds before Kate deliberately redirected her gaze to the middle distance and reminded herself that she had arrived in Redrock Falls for the express purpose of marrying Harlan Webb and becoming a practical woman, and that was the end of the matter. She found out his name 2 hours later, when Harlan Webb came to collect her from the boarding house where she had taken a room to wash the trail dust off, and walked her down the main street making introductions. Redrock Falls was not a large town, perhaps 400 souls, and Harlan Webb was clearly a man of consequence within it. The hardware store owner, the doctor, the blacksmith, the proprietress of the millinery shop, the preacher's wife. And then, as they rounded the corner near the land office, Harlan said, in a voice that dropped about half a degree in temperature, "And this is Cecil Trask. He manages the crescent moon spread on the north side of the valley." Cecil Trask had looked at her then with recognition, a tiny flicker of it, there and gone in an instant. He removed his hat, which was proper, and said, "Miss Fairchild," which was correct, and shook Harlan's hand, which was expected. And then he put his hat back on and went about his business, and Kate went about hers. But Harlan, as they walked on, said, "Keep clear of Trask," quietly, without looking at her. "I beg your pardon. He is not what he seems. There is a dark past there, and it has a long shadow." Harlan said it with the finality of a man pronouncing judgment, and Kate, who was in the process of trying to be practical and biddable, said nothing. But something in her noted the warning the way the body notes a change in weather, involuntarily, without permission. The courtship between Kate and Harlan Webb, if it could be called that, proceeded over the following weeks with the romantic heat of a land transaction. Harlan was not cruel. He was simply, Kate came to understand, a man for whom other people were primarily useful. He took her to dinner twice at the hotel. He showed her around the ranch, which was impressive, 3,000 acres of grassland and cattle and a solid house with glass windows. He explained what would be required of her. He used the word required with great ease. Kate listened and smiled and thought about the $17, which was now 12, and the wooden trunk, and the locked room inside herself where the dark past lived, and she told herself this was survivable. Plenty of things were survivable. She had evidence of this. It was at the church social in mid-June that everything began to go complicated. The Redrock Falls Community Church held a monthly social on the second Saturday of each month, a gathering in the churchyard with pie and lemonade and fiddle music that served the dual purpose of Christian fellowship, and the kind of community gossip that could only be efficiently conducted standing in a group while holding a tin plate. Kate attended, as Harlan Webb's intended, a status that made certain women treat her with a particular combination of congratulation and pity that she found exhausting. She had separated herself from the group under the pretense of refilling her lemonade and was standing near the church's back wall in the shade of a sprawling live oak when she became aware that someone had positioned themselves beside her with similar antisocial intent. Cecil Trask, holding a piece of peach pie as if he had forgotten he was holding it. "You look," he said without preamble, "like a woman calculating escape routes." Kate looked at him. He was looking at the gathering, not at her, and his expression was neutral, almost pleasant. She said, "And you look like a man who has already found his." He glanced at her then, and something in his face shifted almost imperceptibly. "Fair point," he said. They stood in silence for a moment which should have been awkward and was instead inexplicably restful. "You are from San Antonio," he said. "Originally from Galveston, San Antonio most recently." "I know Galveston a little." He did not elaborate, and something in the way he said it suggested the elaboration would be complicated. "Mr. Webb tells me you manage the Crescent Moon," she said, keeping her voice light and informational. "I do. Have done for 4 years." A pause. "He told you to stay clear of me, didn't he?" It was not phrased as a question. Kate kept her expression perfectly composed. "He mentioned you had a complicated history." Cecil Trask laughed then, a short, genuine sound that startled her with its warmth. "That is one way to put it." He looked at her directly now, and she made herself hold the gaze steadily. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, nodding toward a stout woman in a blue dress who was heading purposefully in their direction, "is coming to separate us in approximately 15 seconds in service of propriety and her own entertainment. Before she arrives, I would like to say that I hope you will be happy here, Miss Fairchild." Genuinely. He said it simply, without performance, and then Mrs. Morrison arrived and the conversation was over, and Kate spent the rest of the social being properly attentive to Harlan Webb and thoroughly refusing to think about Cecil Trask at all. She was only partially successful. Over the weeks of the high summer, she began to learn the shape of Redrock Falls the way you learn a place you did not choose, by accumulation of small details rather than deliberate study. She learned that the schoolteacher, Miss Prentice, was secretly engaged to the minister's son, which was complicated because the minister disapproved. She learned that the doctor, old Dr. Henley, had a genuine gift for medicine despite his rough manner. She learned that the creek flooded dangerously in heavy rain, and that everyone in town had strong, specific opinions about the best method of dealing with this. She learned, without intending to, the pattern of Cecil Trask's presence in Redrock Falls. He came into town on Tuesdays for supplies, sometimes on Saturdays for the social or to pick up mail. He had a room at the Red Mesa Hotel when he needed to stay in town, though he usually rode back to the Crescent Moon in the evening. He was quietly well regarded by most people, the blacksmith, the doctor, the hardware store owner, though there was clearly some kind of history with Harlan Webb that put a particular strain in the air whenever the two men were within 50 yards of each other. She did not ask about this directly. She was not yet in a position to ask about things directly. She was still in the process of trying to become the kind of person who could marry Harlan Webb and find that sufficient. The first time she spoke to Cecil Trask at any real length was an accident. She had gone to Dr. Henley's office at the end of July with a persistent headache that had lasted 3 days, which Harlan considered an insufficient reason to see a doctor but which had begun to frighten her. The waiting area was empty when she arrived, and she settled in the hard chair by the window with the copy of Harper's Weekly that lived on the small table there. She heard voices from the inner room, the doctor's, and another lower. She was not listening with intent, but the walls were thin. She heard, "The results are the same as last time, Trask. I cannot tell you anything different." And then, quieter, "I understand, Henley. I am not asking you to." And then the door opened and Cecil Trask came out and stopped dead when he saw her, and she looked up from her magazine and their eyes met across the small waiting room, and something in his face that he had been keeping carefully controlled slipped for just a moment, and she saw it, whatever it was, before he put the composure back. He said, "Miss Fairchild," and nodded, and she said, "Mr. Trask," and nodded, and he left, and she sat there with Harper's Weekly and the echo of that unguarded expression on his face and felt the first genuine, unwanted tendril of concern for a person she had absolutely no business concerning herself with unfurl in her chest. When Dr. Henley appeared in the doorway, she said, without thinking, "Is Mr. Trask quite well?" Henley looked at her with sharp, shrewd eyes. "That," he said carefully, "is not mine to say." She understood that. She understood it very well. She went in and reported her headache and received a lecture about the necessity of drinking adequate water in the Texas heat and a small bottle of something for the pain, and she went home and was practical and sensible, and did not think about Cecil Trask looking controlled and alone in that doorway. August burned like a furnace. The whole valley shimmered. The cattle on Harlan's ranch lost weight that they could not afford to lose, and Harlan's temper, never particularly sweet, grew shorter and sharper. He had not yet proposed formally, which Kate found increasingly peculiar. They were understood to be betrothed in the way of such arrangements, but no ring had been produced, no date discussed. When she tried, gently, to raise the subject, he diverted her with the smoothness of a man who has practiced diversion. She began to wonder what, precisely, she had agreed to. The revelation came on an August evening, not with drama, but with the quiet, sickening quality of a thing sliding into focus that had been blurry for too long. She had gone to the general store to pick up some thread, and she overheard two women talking in the dry goods aisle, not about her but adjacent to her, about Harlan Webb's situation. "The trouble is the debt," one woman said. "He took out loans against the ranch 2 years back when the drought killed the herd, substantial loans, and the note is due this spring." "And the Fairchild girl," said the other. "She has family money, apparently, a trust from her father's estate." Kate stood between bolts of cotton fabric and felt the room tilt slightly. Her father's trust was not large, $300, enough to be useful to a struggling rancher, enough to be the actual reason for an advertisement in the San Antonio Daily Herald. She paid for her thread with a steady hand and walked back to the boarding house and sat on her cot and looked at the wall for a long time. She had known, she acknowledged to herself in that moment, that practical arrangements involved practical motives. She had known Harlan Webb was not marrying her for love. She had thought, hoped, that there was at least a degree of honesty in the transaction, that he wanted a capable woman to run his household, that she would have security in exchange for her labor. This was an exchange she could live within, but this was different. This was hidden motive. This was a trap dressed in the language of courtship, and she was the bait and the prey simultaneously, and the $300 her father had left her was sitting in a bank in San Antonio ready to be transferred into Harlan Webb's struggling hands the moment she said, "I do." She spent 2 days being very quiet and thinking very hard. On the 3rd day, she encountered Cecil Trask at the general store. He was buying coffee and flour and a box of ammunition for what she could see was a Winchester rifle, and he looked at her with that steady, careful attention he always gave people and must have read something in her face because he said, without any social preamble, "Are you all right?" "Perfectly fine," she said, in the bright, crisp voice she had learned to deploy like a shield. He looked at her for a beat longer than was strictly comfortable. "That was not actually a social question," he said. "I was asking in earnest." She looked at him. He was watching her with those dark, serious eyes, and there was something in his expression that was neither pity nor acquisitiveness nor the particular evaluating look that men gave women they considered managing. It was simple, genuine concern, and it undid her just a little. "I am dealing with something," she said quietly, "a revelation about my situation that requires recalibration." His jaw tightened slightly. "Webb," he said, not a question. She said nothing, which was answer enough. Cecil Trask set his coffee and flour on the counter. "Walk with me a moment," he said, "if you are willing." They walked out to the street and stood near the edge of the boardwalk in the late morning light, and he said, "I am going to tell you something that I have had no particular right to tell you until this moment, because until this moment it was not my business. But your situation changes that." He looked at her steadily. "Harlan Webb is not a dishonest man in the criminal sense. He does not steal outright. But he is a man who considers himself entitled to take what he needs from whatever source is available, and he considers women particularly reliable sources." A pause. "His first wife, Marion. She died 3 years ago. She had a modest inheritance from her family. By the time she died, it was gone." Kate was quiet for a moment. The red dust moved in the street. A horse stood at the hitching post, patient and indifferent. "How do you know this?" she said. "Marion Webb was my cousin," Cecil said. "Not close, second cousin, but I knew her. I watched what happened." The silence between them was dense with things unsaid. Kate felt the weight of it, the pattern of it, the way it changed the landscape of the last 3 months. "Why did you not say something before?" she said. She was not accusing, simply asking. He looked away for a moment, something moving in his face. because you had come a long way and made an arrangement, and I was not certain you had not made it with full knowledge. Some women in difficult circumstances make peace with difficult bargains. That is their right. But what I heard in your voice just now is not a woman at peace with a bargain. It is a woman who has just discovered the bargain was not what she thought. And if I had arrived knowing exactly what I was walking into, then I would have stayed out of it. He looked back at her. Miss Fairchild, you have every right to make your own choices. I am not here to rescue you from a decision you have made, but I am here to make sure you have accurate information to make it with. It was, she thought, perhaps the most respectful thing anyone had said to her in years, possibly ever. She thanked him carefully and went back to the boarding house and began, quietly and methodically, to reconsider everything. The decision not to marry Harlan Webb was not made dramatically. There was no single confrontation, no thrown ring or slammed door. Kate was a practical woman and she handled it practically. She went to Harlan 2 days later and told him, in measured terms, that she had reconsidered the arrangement and did not believe they were well suited, and that she was sorry for the inconvenience. Harlan's face went through several expressions in quick succession. Surprise, calculation, and then a cold anger that he controlled with visible effort. He did not beg. He did not apologize or confess or attempt transparency. He simply said, "That is a significant error in judgment, Miss Fairchild," in a tone that was more threat than warning, and she said, "Perhaps so. Good evening, Mr. Webb," and walked away. The relief was enormous. And beneath the relief, the immediate, practical terror of her situation, because she had now been in Redrock Falls for nearly 3 months. Her money was nearly gone. She had no position and no plan, and Texas in September was no more hospitable to unattached women of limited means than it had been in May. She went to Millie Dunbar, who ran the boarding house, and explained her situation with honesty, which she found worked better than artifice in most cases. Millie Dunbar was a 60-year-old woman with iron-gray hair and a face that had seen considerable weather and emerged from the experience with a healthy skepticism about the world's intentions. "Can you cook?" Millie said. "Yes." "Keep accounts?" "Yes." "Deal with difficult people without losing your composure?" "I have some practice," Kate said dryly. Millie nodded. "I need a helper, room and small wage. It is not elegant." "I do not need elegant," Kate said. "I need solvent," so she stayed. She cooked and kept accounts and dealt with difficult people and made herself indispensable to Millie Dunbar. And the days of the autumn moved by in the amber light of West Texas, and she settled into a life that was not what she had planned but was, she found, actually livable. She saw Cecil Trask on Tuesdays and sometimes Saturdays. They began to speak with increasing naturalness, the kind of ease that builds when two people have established that they are honest with each other. She learned that he had grown up in Houston, that he had come west at 22 with the specific intention of working with cattle, that he had been at the Crescent Moon for 4 years because the owner, a man named Garrett, was rarely present and trusted Cecil to run it. She learned that he read seriously, that he had strong opinions about land management, that he had a dry, quiet humor that surfaced unpredictably and was funnier for being unexpected. She did not learn about the dark past, not for a while, and she did not push because she understood the locked room. She did notice that he went to Dr. Henley's office regularly, once a month it seemed. She noticed that some days he moved more carefully than others, as if something hurt that he was not acknowledging. She filed these observations away without analysis, because she had not been given any right to analyze them. Harlan Webb, for his part, did not behave well about the broken engagement, which had perhaps been predictable. He did not cause any open scandal, but there was a coldness in his manner toward her that he was clearly not troubled to conceal, and a subtle campaign of small social undermining that Kate recognized for what it was, and was too tired to fight directly. He implied, in conversations she only heard about secondhand, that she had come to Redrock Falls under false pretenses, that her circumstances in San Antonio had been worse than she had let on. Nothing specific enough to be actionable, just the persistent, corrosive drip of a man with wounded pride and a community standing he wanted to protect. Kate dealt with this by being so consistently competent and pleasant that no amount of dripping could wash away the direct evidence of her character that people encountered every day. It was tiring. It was also effective. October passed in the colors of dried grass and far-off fires, and November arrived with a cold snap that came down from the north in the second week with no warning and left everyone scrambling for their winter stores. The boarding house pipes protested loudly. Kate's room, the smallest room in the back of the building, lost what little insulation it had possessed, and she slept with every item of clothing she owned piled on top of her blankets. And then came the Sunday of November the 12th. The Redrock Falls Community Church held its regular service on Sunday morning, as it had done every week since its founding in 1869. Reverend Dawes preached from the Book of Ruth, which Kate thought was either coincidence or pointed, and the congregation sang with the dutiful enthusiasm of people who had been raised to sing in church and had never fully questioned whether they enjoyed it. Kate was cold. She had been cold since Tuesday and had not been able to get properly warm since. The church had a wood stove at the front, but she was seated near the middle, toward the end of a pew, and the heat did not reach her. She had worn everything reasonable that she owned, her gray wool dress and the heavier shawl and the pair of half-gloves that were more gesture than protection. But the wind found the gaps in the church's old pine walls with malicious accuracy, and she was shivering in small, involuntary waves that she was trying to suppress because it was embarrassing. She was concentrating very hard on not shivering visibly, with the fixed attention of a woman who has a great deal of practice directing her will at things that were slightly beyond her control when she felt it. The weight first, settling over her shoulders from behind, warm and solid and real. Then the smell of it, pine resin and leather and cold morning air, and she knew. She knew before she could turn, before she could think. She knew whose coat it was. Cecil Trask had been sitting in the pew directly behind her, which she had not known because she had arrived after the service began and had not looked behind her. He had watched her shiver for several minutes, she learned later, and had done something that was, she thought afterward, perfectly characteristic of him. He had not leaned forward and made a production of it. He had not whispered loudly and called attention to them both. He had simply, quietly, slipped his coat from his own shoulders and laid it over hers, as naturally as breathing, as if the transfer of warmth between two cold people was the most obvious thing in the world. She gripped the lapels and pulled the coat close and did not turn around. Behind her, Reverend Dawes continued about Ruth and faithfulness, and the person we become when we stop running from the place we are supposed to be, and Kate sat in the warmth of Cecil Trask's coat and felt, with a clarity that alarmed her thoroughly, that she had been running from the fact of this man for 6 months and was extremely tired. After the service, she turned. He was there standing in the aisle, and when she made to remove the coat and hand it back, he shook his head once, brief and final. "Keep it through the afternoon," he said. "Return it tomorrow if you like." She looked at him. He was in shirt sleeves now, which in November Texas was not comfortable, and he did not look cold, or rather he looked cold and entirely indifferent to it, and his eyes when they met hers were very direct and very calm and very serious. "You will freeze," she said. "I will be fine." A pause. "I have been meaning to speak with you. Have you, if you are willing?" They ended up at the hotel restaurant, which was open on Sundays for the post-service crowd, seated at a small table by the window where the weak November sun came in. They ordered coffee, which arrived hot and black and necessary, and Cecil Trask looked at his cup for a moment, and Kate, who had learned to read the way he organized himself before saying something difficult, waited. "I am going to tell you something," he said, "that I have not told many people. And I want to say first that I am not telling you because I want anything from you as a result. I am telling you because I think you deserve to know it, and because I think I am, perhaps, not in a position to leave things unsaid much longer." Kate set down her cup carefully. The noise of the restaurant moved around them. "4 years ago," he said, I was diagnosed with a condition of the lungs. Dr. Henley, who was practicing in Houston at that time, identified it. It is a slow deterioration, he says, not rapid. He has seen men live with it for many years. But it is not something that resolves. He looked at her steadily. The reason I came to West Texas specifically was the climate, drier higher. Henley believed it would slow the progression. So far, he appears to have been correct. A pause. I am telling you this because I have noticed over these past months that you and I have been building something, or at least I have been building something, and I would not do that without you knowing what you were building it on. The restaurant moved around them, plates and voices in the thin winter sunlight. Kate said, "What does Dr. Henley say about your current situation?" "That I am stable, that the climate is helping, that there is no certainty about timelines in either direction." "But you are well now, currently." "Currently I feel quite well, yes." He looked at her with something careful in his eyes. "I am not asking you for anything, Miss Fairchild. I want to be very clear about that. I am not presenting you with a difficult situation and expecting sympathy to do the work that genuine feeling should do. I am simply telling you the truth because I believe you deserve truth, and because if you ever looked at me with any kind of interest and I had not told you, I would not be able to live with that." Kate was quiet for a moment, arranging her thoughts. "Cecil," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name and she saw him register it. "I have a locked room inside myself that I have not shown you either, if we are being honest." He waited. "I left Galveston," she said, "when I was 22. There was a man. We were engaged. Not a formal arrangement like Webb, but a real engagement, chosen, wanted." She looked at the window. "He left, quite suddenly and completely. There was no explanation adequate to the size of the leaving. He simply was there and then was not, and took with him what I had believed to be the central certainty of my life." She looked back at Cecil. "I spent 4 years in San Antonio being practical and healing, and I was mostly healed, I think, which is why I was able to consider an arrangement like Webb's without it destroying me. But it also means that I learned to be very careful about the difference between practical decisions and genuine feeling, because I had once confused them catastrophically in the other direction." Cecil was listening with that quality of attention he had, total and unhurried. "I have not been confused about you," she said quietly. "Not once, which is why I have been frightened of you specifically, for 6 months." The moment sat between them with the weight of everything neither of them had yet said. "What I am telling you," she said, "is that I know the difference, and that this is the real kind." Cecil reached across the small table and covered her hand with his, and his hand was warm and large and completely steady, and Kate turned her hand over and held on. They did not rush anything. It was not in the nature of either of them to rush, and there was also the practical matter of their respective situations to consider. Kate was employed at Millie Dunbar's boarding house and had been for 2 months. Cecil managed the Crescent Moon and lived on the spread. Neither of them was in a position for hasty decisions, but they began, from that Sunday in November, to build something with intention and openness. He came to the boarding house on Wednesday evenings, which became understood as his evening, and sat at the kitchen table after the supper dishes were done and talked with her while she mended or kept the accounts. And Millie Dunbar, who was an old woman and no fool, provided them with coffee and occasional commentary, and the particular gift of being present enough to maintain propriety and discreet enough to allow genuine conversation. They talked about everything. Land and cattle and the politics of Texas, which in 1882 were considerable. The fence-cutting war that was beginning to stir across the state, barbed wire going up everywhere, and cattlemen furious about closed range. The railroads coming in and changing the economics of everything. What she had loved and missed about Galveston, the smell of the Gulf, the particular quality of coastal light. What Houston had been like in his childhood, a growing city that was discovering it could be significant. Books, which they both read seriously and with strong opinions. The nature of God, on which they disagreed in ways that were interesting rather than divisive. And slowly, carefully, like two people learning to trust ice, the personal things. He told her about his parents, his father who had been a carpenter with a love of order and his mother who had been a gardener with a love of chaos, and how he had always been trying to reconcile those two inheritances. She told him about her father, who had been quiet and kind and given her books and trusted her mind in a way that was unusual for the time, and about her mother, who had been frightened and practical and communicated love imperfectly, because she had been too busy surviving to learn the vocabulary. He told her more about Marion, his second cousin, who had been funny and stubborn and chosen Harlan Webb because she had wanted security and learned too late what kind of man provided it. Kate told him about the 4 years in San Antonio, the work as a seamstress, the gradual, painful process of reassembling a self that had been scattered. By December, Redrock Falls had noticed them. This was inevitable. Small towns in 1882, Texas, had a comprehensive surveillance network powered entirely by human curiosity and winter boredom, and two people conducting a dignified but clearly significant courtship were not going to escape comment. The majority of the town seemed to approve, which surprised Kate a little. Cecil was well regarded, she had known this, but she had not fully understood the depth of the affection people had for him until she was standing in the Mercantile one afternoon and heard Mrs. Morrison, who was not always kind, say to Mrs. Garrett, "It would be good for him finding happiness. That man has carried enough on his own." Harlan Webb did not approve. This was also inevitable. He had been publicly jilted, he felt, though Kate had been as private and considerate about the ending as the situation allowed, and the sight of her thriving and clearly happy in Redrock Falls was apparently enraging in the specific way that comes when someone refuses to cooperate with the narrative you have assigned them. He said something to Cecil in the street in December. She never knew exactly what, because Cecil told her only that Harlan had expressed an opinion about her character, and that he had disagreed with the opinion firmly, and the conversation was over. But she saw Cecil's face when he came to the boarding house that evening and she said, "Tell me," and he looked at her and said, "No," and she understood that he was protecting her from something ugly and also that he was angry on her behalf in a way that was quiet and deep and not inclined to be performed. "If he says anything directly to me," she said, "I am capable of handling it." "I know," Cecil said. "That is not in question." He looked at his coffee cup. "I simply did not want to carry it in here. This is a clean space." She understood that too. Christmas in Redrock Falls was modest and genuine, the way Christmas often was on the frontier, a practical community pulling together in the cold with what they had. The church decorated with pine boughs and red ribbon. Millie Dunbar made a remarkable amount of food and invited several people who had nowhere else to go. Cecil came to Christmas dinner and sat at the boarding house table with Millie and Kate and the two other boarders, a retired miner named Huxley and a young schoolteacher named Agnes Prentice, who was the same Agnes whose secret engagement had been a matter of town speculation. It was a good day. Kate sat across from Cecil and watched him talk to old Huxley about mining, and then to Agnes about the difficulties of keeping order in a schoolroom with 30 children of varying ages. And she thought, this is what it is supposed to look like. A person who is genuinely present and interested and kind, not performing it but simply being it. And she felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for a very long time. After dinner, when the dishes were done and Millie was dozing by the stove and Huxley had gone to his room and Agnes had returned home, Cecil and Kate sat together in the kitchen with the last of the coffee growing cold and the oil lamp throwing warm light, and he reached over and tucked a loose strand of her hair back from her face, very gently, and she turned into the gesture, and he kissed her for the first time, careful and warm and entirely certain. And she kissed him back with 4 years of loneliness and 6 months of wanting and everything she had been building since November laid into it. They were both, she thought, people who had learned not to waste things, who had been educated by loss in the value of what was real. She felt the truth of that in the way he held her, firmly and carefully at once, as if she was both sturdy and precious. January of 1883 arrived with cold and mud and the particular relentlessness of a Texas winter, which was not as harsh as what she had heard of the northern territories but was committed. The fence-cutting war heated up across the state, with wire-cutting gangs operating at night and cattlemen and landowners in open conflict over the closing of the open range. It came close to Redrock Falls in the form of a conflict between three of the larger ranchers in the valley, including Harlan Webb, who had put up wire, and several smaller operators who depended on access to the creek. Cecil was pulled into this, tangentially, because the crescent moon shared a fence line with one of the disputing properties, and Garrett, who was never present, sent letters from Houston with strong opinions and little practical guidance. Cecil navigated it with the steady pragmatism that Kate had come to understand was one of his fundamental qualities. He was not afraid of conflict, but he did not enjoy it, and he had a way of seeing the legitimate interest on multiple sides of a dispute that made him useful as a moderating presence. He was also, she noticed, more tired in January than he had been in November. He did not say anything about it, and she did not push, but she noticed the way he occasionally had to stop and regulate his breathing in a way that was careful and deliberate, the way he sometimes had a cough in the mornings that he minimized. She noticed and said nothing and thought hard about what she was doing with her heart. She went to see Dr. Henley in late January, not with a headache this time. She sat across his desk and asked him directly to tell her what she should understand about Cecil Trask's condition. Henley looked at her for a long moment. "I am not at liberty," he started. "I know," she said. "I am not asking for medical specifics. I am asking as a person who is building a life alongside him and needs to do that honestly. I need to know if there is something I should understand about what that will look like." Henley considered this for a while, in the particular way of a doctor deciding how much truth is cruel and how much is necessary. "The condition," he said carefully, "is a scarring of the lung tissue. It progresses slowly. The dry climate here has genuinely helped more than I initially expected, if I am honest. He has been stable for over a year now. Some men in his situation live decades, others do not. There is no certainty either direction." He looked at her. "He is a strong man in good general health outside of this specific situation. He does not push himself unreasonably. He is not, to the best of my knowledge, dying at any near remove." A pause. "I would say this, Miss Fairchild. If you are choosing whether to love this man based on a guarantee of decades, I cannot give you that guarantee. But I also cannot give it to anyone. Cowboys die. Men fall off horses, catch fevers, get shot over fence lines. There are no guarantees. What I can tell you is that Cecil Trask has more awareness of his own mortality than most people and has chosen, as a result, to live deliberately. That is not a bad quality in a partner." She sat with that for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "That was helpful." She told Cecil that Wednesday evening that she had spoken to Henley. She told him straight because he deserved that, and she watched his face move through several things, and then he said very quietly, "All right," and she reached across and took his hand and said, "I am not telling you because I am stepping back. I am telling you because I am stepping forward with full knowledge. I wanted you to know that." He was quiet for a long time. The fire in the kitchen stove made its small sounds. "I do not know what I did," he said finally, "to deserve someone like you coming through this specific town." "Ruth ended up in Bose's field," she said and smiled, and he looked at her startled and then started to laugh, a real, warm, full sound that she had been accumulating evidence of all these months and still found capable of reordering her internal landscape. He proposed in February, not with elaborate ceremony, which would not have suited either of them. They were walking along the creek on a Sunday afternoon, the first afternoon warm enough to be outside with comfort, the willows just beginning to think about coming back. He stopped walking and turned to face her and said, "I would like to marry you, Kate. I would like that very much, if you are willing." She looked at him, this man who had slipped his coat over her cold shoulders without asking for anything in return, who had told her his darkest truth before she had time to love him past the point of running, who had been patient and honest and careful and warm all these months, and she said, "I am willing. I am more than willing." He produced a ring from his coat pocket, a simple gold band with a small garnet, and she thought it was entirely perfect and told him so, and he put it on her finger, and then she went up on her toes and kissed him with the willows greening around them and the creek running cold and bright at their feet, and the red bluffs of Redrock Falls holding them in. The wedding was set for April, practical enough to allow time for preparation, and for Cecil to make arrangements at the Crescent Moon. Garrett, informed by letter, was supportive in the distracted way of a man whose mind was primarily elsewhere, and agreed that Cecil could build a proper house on the northeast corner of the spread, which had better grass and a reliable water source, and had always seemed to Cecil the best site on the property. The process of planning a wedding while also planning a home, while also managing the daily realities of the boarding house, and the Crescent Moon kept them both occupied in the early months of 1883, which Kate thought was probably healthy. She was not a woman who did well with too much space for abstract worrying, and neither, she suspected, was he. The practical realities also gave her something she had not expected, which was a deep pleasure in the specific details of building a shared life, choosing what the kitchen would look like, discussing what they needed versus what they wanted, and where those categories overlapped. She had opinions about these things that she had never had occasion to express before, and he had opinions, and the process of reconciling them was unexpectedly fun. She had his mother's love of good chaos. He had his father's love of order. They compromised, which she thought was probably also good practice. Harlan Webb left Redrock Falls in March. She learned this from Millie, who learned it from the general store proprietor, who had it from the bank. The loans had come due and could not be serviced. The ranch was going to a creditor. Harlan had left quietly, sometime in the second week of March, with no farewell and no forwarding address. Kate felt no triumph, only a kind of tired sorrow for a man who had been so committed to the appearance of abundance that he had mortgaged everything real. She thought about Marion, Cecil's cousin, and the money that was gone, and she felt the sorrow for that too. Cecil received the news with a long silence and then said, "I hope he goes somewhere and genuinely starts over. I hope he learns something." He said it without rancor, which Kate thought required a more generous spirit than she currently possessed on the subject, and told him so, and he said, "Anger requires energy I would rather spend elsewhere." And she thought that was one of the truest things she had ever heard anyone say. The house on the Crescent Moon was not finished by April, but the most essential rooms were habitable. The kitchen, the bedroom, the main room, and Cecil's position as manager meant they would have use of the larger ranch house for anything that required more space. They decided to proceed with the April wedding as planned and move into the house as it stood, which Kate found perfectly satisfactory. She had spent 8 months in a small room at the back of a boarding house, and she was not a woman who required luxury. She was a woman who required honesty and warmth and a reliable water source. The wedding was on a Saturday in mid-April, 1883. The church was full, which surprised Kate a little and moved her considerably. She had not expected Redrock Falls to show up for her in that way. She had been there less than a year and had arrived under circumstances that were complicated. But the town had watched and decided, apparently, and here they were. She wore a cream-colored dress that Agnes Prentice had helped her make from good wool, simple and well-cut, and carried a small bunch of the wild bluebonnets that had erupted along the creek bank that week. She had no family to walk her down the aisle, which she had expected and made peace with, so she walked herself, which felt, when it came to it, entirely right. She was a woman who had walked a considerable distance on her own terms, and there was a kind of truth in arriving at this moment on her own feet. Cecil was waiting at the front of the church in his good dark coat, and he watched her come down the aisle with an expression that made her forget for a moment that there were other people in the building. Reverend Dawes married them efficiently and with genuine warmth. When Cecil took her hands, they were both steady, which she thought was a kind of testament to what they had built. Not the wild, destabilizing feeling of the first engagement in Galveston, when she had been 22 and terrified and exhilarated. Something different, deeper-rooted, less like falling and more like arriving. They said, "I do," and meant it completely, and he kissed her at the altar with appropriate restraint, and the church burst into the kind of noise that small communities make when they have been waiting for something, and it finally arrives. The spring of 1883 was everything Kate had not known she was hoping for. The house on the crescent moon smelled of new wood and pine resin, and the cedar chips she scattered in the closets, and it caught the morning light on the east side in a way that made the bedroom luminous until about 9 o'clock, and there were bluebirds in the cedar tree outside the kitchen window, and the grass was long and green from the winter rains, and the cattle were fattening well. And Cecil came in from the range at the end of the day with red dust on his boots, and a quiet satisfaction about him that she found, to her continuing surprise, one of the most beautiful things she had ever seen. They had been married 2 months when she learned to love the cattle, or at least to appreciate them in a way that approached affection. She went out with Cecil one morning to check on a heifer that had not come in with the others, and they found her in a draw near the creek having her first calf, and Kate crouched in the grass in her everyday dress and watched the whole impossible, ungainly, miraculous process. And when the calf stood up on its absurd legs for the first time, she turned to Cecil, and he was watching her watch it, and the look on his face made her feel like the center of something warm and permanent. She kept the boarding house accounts still at Millie's request, going into town on Tuesdays, which had been his day and was now their day. So they went together and she did the accounts and he collected supplies and they had coffee at the hotel at midday. The town had absorbed them as a unit, which she found she liked. Kate and Cecil Trask, the sound of it. Summer came in hard and hot as it did, and Cecil managed the heat, and the work with the same measured care he managed everything, not pushing past his limits, not treating himself as invincible, which had been a hard lesson she gathered from the way he talked about his early years when he had been considerably less sensible about what a body required. She watched him and learned the difference between his regular tired and the specific kind of tired that meant she needed to make him sit down and drink water and not talk for an hour, and she deployed this knowledge when necessary without fanfare, and he accepted it without argument, which she thought was a kind of daily love that the poems did not discuss often enough. In August, she told him she was pregnant. She had suspected for 3 weeks and confirmed it, in her own estimation, for 2, and spent those 2 weeks walking around with this knowledge inside her like a lantern, feeling it illuminate everything it touched. She told him in the kitchen after supper, because the kitchen was where they did their best talking, and she had planned a measured and considered announcement, and instead simply said, "I am going to have a child," the moment he looked up from the newspaper he had been reading. He put the newspaper down very carefully, the way a person handles something fragile. His face did several things in rapid succession. And then he stood up and came around the table and held her, and she could feel him breathing, deliberate and full, the way he breathed when something was large. "Are you well?" he said into her hair. "I feel fine. A little sick in the mornings, but Millie says that is normal." "You told Millie." "Millie told me what the symptoms meant. I had wondered about it." She pulled back to look at his face. "Cecil." "Yes. You look frightened." "I am," he said it plainly. "I am frightened and I am also happier than I have words for, and both of those things are true simultaneously." She kissed him and he held on, and outside the kitchen window the Texas summer burned down in shades of orange and gold. He went to see Dr. Henley the following week. she knew, for the regular appointment and also to discuss what her pregnancy would mean practically. Henley came out to see her himself a few days later, drove his buggy out on a weekday morning, which was unusual, and she made him coffee, and he looked her over with professional thoroughness and declared her in excellent health and gave her a list of sensible recommendations about rest and nourishment and what to watch for. "He worries," she said when the examination was done. Henley snorted. "I know. He has worried about everything since he arrived in this valley. He has just done it very quietly." He picked up his hat. "His lungs are stable, Mrs. Trask. Still, I will keep watching. But he has a good chance of a long life, and I think that chance has gotten better since last spring. Happiness is not nothing, medically speaking. I believe that more than I once did." She thanked him and walked him to his buggy and stood in the morning light watching him drive back down the valley road and felt, with fierce and grateful precision, how much she wanted every single one of these ordinary days. The autumn brought a son. He arrived in early November, which she thought had a kind of rightness to it, November being the month that had changed everything. The birth was long and hard, and presided over by Millie Dunbar, who had delivered a dozen children in her time, and who handled the whole proceeding with the calm competence of a woman who knew that the work of the world was done by women who showed up and did what was necessary. Cecil was on the other side of the door for most of it, which was customary, and Kate heard him pacing faintly, which she found endearing in a way that she would tell him about later when she had the energy. The baby was strong and loud, and had a quantity of dark hair that was, Cecil said with visible pride when he finally came into the room, quite something. They named him James, for Cecil's father, and for the book of the Bible that Kate had always found the most practically useful. James Trask was the best thing that had ever happened to Kate Fairchild Trask, with the exception of his father, and she said so to Cecil that evening when James was asleep in the cradle, and they were sitting together in the lamplight of the bedroom with the sound of the November wind outside, and the warmth of the new wood stove that Cecil had installed in October, because he was not taking any chances with the temperature. "I would argue," Cecil said, "that James is arguably also the best thing that has happened to me, and that you were first, and that having both of you means that I am, by any reasonable accounting, an extraordinarily fortunate man." "By any reasonable accounting," she agreed, and leaned against him, and he put his arm around her and held on. Redrock Falls greeted James Trask with the particular enthusiasm of a small community for a new life. Millie knitted something impractical and pink, which she defended on the grounds that she had not known the baby's sex, and then knitted a second something in a more suitable blue. Agnes Prentice arrived with a cake, and the news that she and the minister's son, with the minister's eventual blessing, had finally set a wedding date. Dr. Henley came to look at the baby with professional interest and pronounced him sound. Old Huxley at the boarding house sent a note, charmingly written, expressing his good wishes. Winter passed in the warm cocoon of new parenthood, which was exhausting and consuming and brilliant in the specific way of things that take everything you have. James had strong opinions, expressed loudly and often, about food and sleep and the precise temperature of the air and the acceptability of being set down. Cecil, who Kate had not known would be quite so naturally gifted with a small person, discovered that he had a gift for walking with the baby in the kitchen at 3 in the morning, slow, steady circles, until the loud opinions quieted to sleep. She discovered this because she woke one night to silence when there should have been noise and found them there, Cecil and James in the kitchen, the baby asleep against his chest, and Cecil standing at the window looking at the stars. She stood in the doorway and he turned and they looked at each other across the kitchen in the dark, and no words seemed necessary or adequate, so she simply crossed the room and put her arms around both of them, and they stood there together until the fire in the stove needed feeding and the ordinary resuming of life required attending to. Spring of 1884 came back around in the way springs do, inexorable and green and indifferent to everything that had happened since the last one. The fence-cutting war had mostly resolved in the broader sense. the Texas legislature having finally banned wire cutting in November of 1883, though local tensions still simmered and required careful navigation. The crescent moon had had a good year, the herd was healthy, Garrett was pleased, and there was some discussion of Cecil eventually buying into ownership of the spread, which was the sort of conversation that opened up landscapes of possibility. Kate's Tuesday trips to town had become complicated in the excellent way, now requiring the management of a baby in a carrier who had opinions about the rhythm of the ride, and needed to be presented to approximately half the population of Redrock Falls every week, all of whom had specific things to say about his development and resemblance to various relatives. She found this exhausting and charming in equal measure, and told Cecil so, who agreed and suggested the solution was to come to town slightly less often, which she considered and rejected, because she liked the accounting and the contact, and besides James seemed to enjoy the attention once he got over the initial outrage of being looked at. She had been wondering, since James's birth, about the locked room inside herself, the one that had held the fear and the grief from Galveston. She checked on it occasionally, the way you check on a wound you are not sure has fully healed, and she found, to her careful relief, that it was not locked anymore. It was open and empty, the way a room looks when it has been cleaned out and let in light. The things that had been stored there were not pretended away or buried deeper. They had simply run their course and become, as all true grief eventually does, simply part of the story of how she had arrived here. She told Cecil this one evening, not dramatically but as a matter of fact, and he listened with his full attention and then said, "I have had a similar experience with a room of my own." "The prognosis," she said, "partly that, partly other things, the long, specific loneliness before you." He was quiet for a moment. "I used to think the illness was the central fact of my life, the thing that everything else organized around. But it has become, over this past year, just one fact among many and not always the most important one." He looked at her. "You did that, and James did that." She reached for his hand. They were in the kitchen, of course. They were always in the kitchen. "You know," she said, "I arrived in Redrock Falls with $17 and a carpet bag and a plan that was fundamentally unsound, and I ended up here." "Redrock Falls tends to reorganize people's plans," he said. "Or perhaps specific people in Redrock Falls do," she said, and he looked at her with that particular expression that she had been accumulating evidence of for over a year now, the warm, certain, specific look that was only for her, and she felt it the same way she had felt it every time, like the first morning of something. The summer of 1884 was the summer Cecil began seriously negotiating the ownership stake in the Crescent Moon. Garrett, who had never been much interested in ranching as a daily reality and was primarily interested in it as an investment, was open to the idea of a gradual buy-in over several years, structured so that Cecil's accumulated wages and the profits from the herd's improvement over the years he had managed it could count toward the purchase price. It was a complicated arrangement and required a lawyer, which meant a trip to the county seat, which meant 3 days away from the ranch, which was the longest Kate and Cecil had been separated since their marriage. She was fine with this, practically. She had James and Millie who came to stay for the 3 days and the regular work of the ranch, the chickens and the kitchen garden, and the ongoing battle with the fence on the south side that was perpetually coming loose. She managed all of it competently. She did not sleep well. The bed was too large, and the room was too quiet, and she lay awake on the second night, listening to James breathe from his cradle and thinking about the degree to which she had incorporated this man into the basic functioning of her daily self, not in the desperate, losing herself way she had once feared, but in the way of two things that have grown together until their roots are shared, and they are each stronger for it. He came back on the third evening, later than expected, and she heard the horse in the yard and was at the door before he finished dismounting, and he looked at her across the yard in the last of the light with that particular expression, and she felt the tension of 3 days' release all at once. "Well," she said, "The agreement is drafted," he said. "3 years to buy in fully. If the herd continues as it has, we can do it comfortably." He came across the yard. "Garrett says the land is worth considerably more than what I am paying, which is generous, given that I built its value." "You built its value," she agreed. "I had some help." He kissed her unhurried, and she held on with both hands. They went inside, and she fed him the supper she had kept warm, and he told her all the details of the negotiation and held James, who was 8 months old and extremely interested in the collar of Cecil's shirt, and the kitchen was warm and full of ordinary, irreplaceable life. In the fall of that year, Reverend Dawes preached a service on the topic of unexpected grace, which he defined as the grace that arrives in forms we were not looking for and did not believe we deserved. Kate sat in the church with James on her knee and Cecil's shoulder warm against hers, not cold this time, entirely warm, and she thought about November 2 years ago and the weight of a coat settling over her shivering shoulders from behind, and she thought about how the largest pivots of a life sometimes look, in the moment, like nothing more than a practical gesture. He had not been trying to court her. She knew that now in the full historical detail of having learned him thoroughly. He had seen a woman shivering, and he had warm clothing she did not, and he had given it without calculation or expectation of return. That was simply who he was. It was the same quality that had told her the truth about Harlan Webb without any agenda beyond her well-being. The same quality that had confessed his own diagnosis before she was past the point of retreat. The same quality that walked the kitchen at 3 in the morning with a crying baby so she could sleep. She leaned against him slightly, there in the church, and he shifted to accommodate her without looking up from his hymnal, and James reached up and grabbed a handful of her hair with great satisfaction. The congregation sang, and outside the West Texas sky was the impossible deep blue of autumn, and the red bluffs of the valley held the town in their familiar shelter, and Fairchild Trask, who had arrived with $17 and an unsound plan, felt the full dimensions of what she had been given and held them carefully and did not look away. 2 years later, in the autumn of 1886, the crescent moon formally became the property of Cecil Trask. The final payment cleared in October, and Kate drove with him to the county seat to sign the final documents, leaving James, now nearly 3 and a force of considerable personality, with Millie Dunbar for the day. They sat across from the lawyer in a wood-paneled office and signed their names side by side and walked out into the October street with the deed in Cecil's hands and Kate tucked under his arm. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. "How does it feel?" He looked at the document and then at the street and then at her. "Like something I built belongs to me now," he said, "and that the building was the actual thing. The ownership is just the acknowledgement." She thought that was about right. They had dinner at the county seat hotel, which was considerably grander than anything in Redrock Falls, and Cecil ordered wine, which was an occasion in itself. And they ate and talked, and she told him that she thought, given the trajectory of events, that they might be expecting another child sometime around March. He looked at her across the restaurant table with the same careful, full attention as the first time, and then he smiled, which he did not always do broadly, but when he did it reorganized his whole face, and she thought he had never looked more like himself. "March is good," he said. "The weather will be improving by then." She laughed. "That is your primary consideration." "The weather? It is a practical consideration," he said, entirely serious, and she laughed again, and he reached across and covered her hand with his, steady and warm. March brought them a daughter, born in the second week of the month, in the improved weather that Cecil had noted as a practical consideration, and that turned out to be genuinely helpful. She was smaller than James had been but louder about it, arrived with opinions already formed and expressed, and had her father's dark coloring, and what Millie Dunbar declared with authority to be her mother's stubbornness. They named her Ruth, because of that November sermon and because it suited her, a name that meant companion and also arrival in the place you were meant to be. James was cautiously interested in the baby, and then, once it became clear she was not going away, resigned, and then, by the end of the first week, proprietary in a way that was almost funny. He stood at the cradle and informed Ruth gravely of various facts about the ranch and the chickens and the dog, Nelson, who had arrived at the spread as a stray the previous spring and been immediately adopted by James, and then by everyone else by default. Cecil watched all of this with the particular expression Kate had catalogued as peaceful, which was rarer and more valuable than happy. His lungs were stable, had been stable for 3 years now. Henley said he had done something Henley had not been certain was possible, held the condition steady through climate and care, and Henley added with gruff precision, through having something very concrete to live for. He came in for his monthly appointment and went home again, and the condition was part of the daily reality of their life, without being the central fact of it. Kate thought about this sometimes in the early mornings when she was up with Ruth and the house was quiet and the Texas dawn was just beginning to suggest itself in the east. She thought about the specific, unlikely chain of events that had deposited her in this kitchen, in this house, on this land. The advertisement, the stagecoach, the red dust, the wall of the post office, a man reading a folded paper who had looked up at exactly the wrong moment, or the right one, depending on how you counted. The spring of 1887 brought a particularly fierce wildflower season, the bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush rioting along the creek and the valley floor in colors that seemed almost excessive, as if the land was making a point about abundance. Kate put Ruth in the carrier and took James by the hand and walked down to the creek on a Tuesday morning, not a going-to-town Tuesday but a staying-on-the-ranch Tuesday. And they sat in the flowers for a while, and James picked bluebonnets with great industry and presented them to his sister, who regarded them with the critical eye of a child who was not yet sure whether flowers were worthwhile. Cecil found them there an hour later, coming back from checking the south fence that was still, perennially, coming loose. He stood at the edge of the wildflower field and looked at them, his family arranged in the spring light with the red bluffs behind and the creek running, and Kate looked up and saw his face, and what was in it was so direct and complete and unguarded that she felt it across the distance between them like a hand. She stood up, flowers in her hair from James's enthusiastic placement, Ruth on her hip, and walked toward him, and he came toward her and they met in the middle of the bluebonnets. "How is the fence?" she said. "Still loose," he said. "Will always be loose." "I have accepted it." "Growth," she said. He took Ruth from her so she could take James's hand, and they walked back up to the house together through the flowers and the morning light, Nelson appearing from somewhere to accompany them with his particular air of a dog who considers this accompanying to be a professional obligation. And the sky was the deep, uncompromising blue of a Texas spring morning, and the crescent moon spread out before them in all its particular, difficult, beautiful, earned reality. That evening, after the children were in bed and the supper things were done, and the particular quality of evening quiet that Kate had come to love had settled over the house, she and Cecil sat on the porch steps in the cooling air. The stars over West Texas were extraordinary in their excess, too many, too bright, the kind of stars that made the scale of things apparent and either frightened you or settled you, depending on who you were. She leaned against his shoulder. He had his arm around her. Nelson lay at their feet already asleep, twitching with whatever dogs dreamed of. "I have been thinking," she said, "about the Sunday in November." "Which Sunday?" "The 1st November." "The cold church, your coat." He was quiet for a moment. "What about it?" "Did you know," she said, "when you did it, did you know it was going to matter like that?" He considered this for a while, which was characteristic. He did not answer quickly when the question deserved time. "I knew," he said finally, "that you were cold and I was not, and that seemed like a simple problem with a simple solution. But I also knew." He stopped and started again. "I had been paying attention to you for some time by then, trying not to, actually. And I think perhaps the coat was also the thing I did instead of all the other things I wanted to do, which were considerably more complicated." "What other things?" she said, curious. "Take your hand, tell you were remarkable, tell you to stop being so relentlessly competent at everything as a way of protecting yourself from being seen because you were being seen anyway, by me at least." She was quiet for a moment, something warm moving through her chest. "Well," she said, "the coat was a good start." He turned and looked at her, there on the porch steps in the star-excessive Texas night, and she looked back at him. And what passed between them in that look was the whole sum of it, all of it. The red dust and the cold church and the $17 and the long, honest autumn and the winter and the spring and all the seasons since. The cedar tree with the bluebirds and James being walked in the kitchen at 3 in the morning, and Ruth born in the improving weather and the bluebonnets and the south fence that would always be loose, and the years stretching ahead of them, however many they were, certain only in this specific, particular, chosen, real thing. "Cecil," she said. "Yes, I love you. I want to say it plainly because I do not say it plainly enough." He was quiet for a moment and she felt him breathe, deliberate and full. "You say it every day," he said. "By every measure I can count." He kissed her hair. "But plainly is good too. Plainly, Kate, I love you. I have loved you since approximately the second time we spoke, and I will love you for every day I am given, which I intend, with your help, to be a great many." She put her hand over his, there on the porch steps, and held on, and above them the Texas stars continued their excessive, indifferent brilliance, and the ranch was quiet and full and theirs, and the cold church was 2 years behind them, and all the warmth was here, in this place, in this man, in this life that had not been planned and was entirely what she had needed. Nelson twitched in his dream. A mockingbird somewhere in the dark cedar tree sang a few notes experimentally and stopped. The night held them. Kate Fairchild Trask had come to Redrock Falls with $17 and an unsound plan, and she had found in the red dust of West Texas everything she had not known how to ask for. Truth told straight, warmth given freely. A man who had slipped his coat over her cold shoulders from behind and asked nothing in return, and who had kept on in that fashion ever since, in all the ways that mattered, every morning, every ordinary, extraordinary day. She was, she thought, in the full and certain knowledge of what the word meant, home. And James would have more siblings in the years to come, 2 more in fact. A boy they named Henry and a girl they named Clara, and the crescent moon would grow and prosper, and become one of the finest spreads in the valley. And Cecil's lungs would hold steady, Henley growing more optimistic each year, more convinced that what he was witnessing was one of those cases that could not entirely be explained, except by the combination of good climate and good care, and the specific medicine of having people to live for. And Redrock Falls would grow and change, and keep being itself in its obstinate, dusty, beautiful way. And every November, when the cold came down from the north and the church was drafty and the congregation sang with dutiful enthusiasm, Kate would feel the warmth of that first November and wear it like the thing it was, a beginning, a gift, the moment that everything changed when a man saw she was cold and gave her what warmth he had without hesitation or calculation or any expectation of return. That was Cecil Trask. That had always been Cecil Trask. And she had been paying attention since the second time they spoke, too, though she had needed a little longer to admit it. She admitted it now, fully and without reservation, every day, in all the ways she had been told love was supposed to look, and all the ways no one had thought to mention. In the accounts kept carefully and the fence checked reliably, and the coffee made strong and the children raised with honesty, and the hand held steady through the dark nights and the good ones. In the way she turned toward him always. The way she had been turning toward him since a November Sunday when she had gripped the lapels of his coat and pulled the warmth close and known, with the clarity that arrives at the absolute worst possible moment, that she was in serious, irreversible, catastrophic, wonderful trouble. She had been right. She had never been more right about anything in her life. The stars burned on over Redrock Falls, Texas, in the spring of 1887, and the crescent moon was theirs, and the south fence would always be loose, and Kate and Cecil Trask sat on their porch steps in the night air and held on to each other and were, completely and without reservation, home.